Well, look what we got here. And hey, it's Pink Buddha and welcome back to another episode of Force Fridays. Today we're going to talk about the new update that Akai put out. It allows you to use the Force with an external interface. And this video is going to be in two parts. First part is we're going to ask the question, why do you want to even do this? And part two is we're going to look at both the sweet and the sour parts of using an external interface, and particularly this Model 12 by Tascam. Okay, so before we jump in, let's just pause and consider what a huge leap forward this is for Akai to use an external interface with a standalone device and have 32 inputs and outputs. I mean, 32? I don't even think I've ever even come close to using that many inputs or outputs, even on the interface with my computer. And the fact that it's class compliant just means that you can pick and choose the interface that's going to work best for you. And so even though today I'm going to focus on the Tascam Model 12, let's start by asking a key question, like, why do you even want this? Like, are you really wanting more inputs for recording? Because if we're comparing inputs and outputs, the inputs are definitely the weakest link, being that you only have two of them. But now having up to 32 inputs means that you can actually multi-track record, or just simply you're tired of unplugging and plugging new things in every time you switch what you're recording. And if that's your focus, you could choose something as simple as a Zoom recorder that has 4 inputs and a microphone with it. Or are you more interested in expanding the ins and outs on the Force for performing? I mean, definitely anybody at the soundboard at a venue is going to love getting multiple outputs from you. And if you're doing like vocals and external synths and a bunch of other stuff like that, you can now have all those things routing into the Force so you can control it and use some master effects and then send it out to where you need it to be. So then it's just about finding the interface that's going to have the right balance of inputs and outputs. I mean, just check out how many different variations you can search for here on Sweetwater. Or maybe you're actually interested in doing both of these things. And in that case, this Tascam Model 12 or 16 or 24, whichever you choose, could be a great option. And that's because all of these channels can alternate between input and output by these little switches here. So if you're in a recording situation where you need a lot of inputs, then just switch them over to that. If you want it for lots of different outputs, change it to that. These stereo tracks here are great for kind of like the master outputs. So anyways, how you answer that question, why you would actually want an external interface, will help you pick the right one. Okay, so now part 2, let's talk about the sweet and the sour components of using an audio interface with the Force and specifically the Model 12. I do want to say that there are some things in the sour section that you're really going to want to know about before you jump into making a decision. So stay tuned for that. And one of the sweetest aspects, I think, is to just have real sliders. I get really tired of using these kind of digital ones in there with my finger on the Force. And in that same vein, the EQs and the compression, all those things are real knobs that you get to turn. No programming necessary with that. So another sweet aspect about this Tascam is the routing. You can use it like a mixer. So an input can go to the Force or it doesn't have to, meaning that you could insert something into the Tascam with no intention of actually even sending it to the Force. And just select that it goes to either the main or the submix. So now you're in a hybrid mixing situation where you're using this as an interface and as a mixer. Okay, so let's talk now about some sour components. And this is something you really need to know, is that when you decide to use an external interface with the Force, it is an all or nothing decision. That means when you hook up the external interface, none of the inputs here work. And that means you're going to have to spend money on an interface that is at least more than what you have, which is the 2 inputs by 4 outputs. USB interfaces are actually pretty inexpensive these days, but that's because there's a mass market for people who only need a few inputs and outputs. You can see here that the majority of interfaces on the market are just 2 inputs by 2 outputs. My point here is that you're essentially just throwing away what you already have on the Force and then spending money to buy it back. So that's kind of a drag. And to make matters worse, when you use an external interface, the headphone jack is also jacked, which I was actually really disappointed about because I use this one all the time. It's a great chance to monitor the metronome. It's right there with controls right on the front as well. So the fact that this headphone jack will no longer work is a big downside for me. Another sour component in regard to specifically Tascam Model 12 is that when you use these channels for inputs going into the Force, it bypasses the EQ. So nothing you do to this EQ is going to make a difference in how the sound comes into the Force. Kind of takes away from the advantage of having like a hardware mixer. Put a microphone on, listen to the sound, adjust the EQ on it right here with your hands, and then know that the sound that you're already entering into the Force is going to be the sound that you want. As much as I love some of the effects and things like that on the Force, I mean, it's just all digital, so you have to set them up and jump in there and use the touchpad and all that kind of stuff. It's not very fast. So that's kind of a bummer that it bypasses that. So I'm still a little undecided on whether or not I want to keep the Model 12. In terms of using it with the Force, it'd be nice to have around in case I have a situation where I do want to multi-track record into here. Also has some possibilities outside of with the Force. I can use it as an interface into my computer and use these sliders when I work with Ableton or when I'm doing sound design and I want to route a bunch of different microphones and whatnot into here and make some recordings that way. So this might be a piece of gear that I keep around for multiple reasons. Okay, that's a wrap. Give me your thoughts on what you think about this new addition to the Force.